that last dogma is on the Assumption. And Protestants are quick to remark that Jesus ascended into heaven in power and glory. And so why would you Catholics say that Mary ascended into heaven? And doesn't that steal Christ's glory? But did Mary ascend into heaven? Or is there a difference between the Assumption and the Ascension? And is there any biblical evidence for this?
Jesus' ascension involves Jesus going into heaven by his own power. So that's what's wrapped up in our belief in Jesus' ascension. Mary's bodily assumption is not that, because we do not believe that Mary goes into heaven with her body by her own power. She goes into heaven with her body because of the power of Jesus. It's Jesus who is assuming her into heaven with her body. So that would be an essential difference between the ascension of Jesus and the bodily assumption of the Blessed Virgin. And with that distinction, we can see that Mary's bodily assumption no more takes away from Jesus' ascension than our own bodily resurrection or assumption at the end of time, when we're going to receive our bodies back and exist in a heavenly state with our resurrected bodies. The difference between Mary and us is that she gets her resurrected body immediately at the end of her earthly life. We have to wait until the end of time. That's a special privilege that was given to her that's not given to us in accordance with God's divine providence. So Mary's bodily assumption, go ahead. Can
I interject something there? Would you say that the Assumption is and maybe you'll get back to this, maybe I shouldn't, but would you say that it's a consequence of the Immaculate Conception? Romans 6:23 says the wages of sin is death, but Mary never sinned. So could it be seen as a consequence of that?
Well, that would assume that Mary did not die.
Correct. And I was going to ask you later about that.
Yeah, but that's not a part of church teaching. The church is open to the question of whether Mary died or not. But of course, this raises the question, well, if we say she was immaculately conceived, does that necessitate that she not die? And of course, the answer is no. Jesus didn't have original sin, but yet he still died. It's possible for Mary to still have died in accord with God's divine providence for whatever rationale we want to offer there, and still be free from sin, both original and personal. The bodily assumption is separate than whether Mary died or not. The bodily assumption only affirms that at the end of Mary's earthly life, whether that end involved death or not, Mary was taken up into heaven in her glorified body. That's the target, you might say, of the definition. That's precisely what we're affirming. Assumed into heaven bodily with her glorified body, which is irrespective of whether she died or not.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt your free-flowing thought there. So we believe that she was taken up body and soul into heaven after her death. Is there any biblical evidence for that? What evidence does the Catholic Church have of that?
Yeah, well, there is one text that converges with this sacred tradition. So Mary's bodily assumption is primarily based on sacred tradition, and the church giving us this dogma in light of sacred tradition. Now, there is scriptural text, at least one particular passage, that converges with this tradition and maps on with it, which at least can provide us some biblical justification for the dogma. It's not necessarily a proof text, but it's pretty darn close, and it converges with the tradition. So in Revelation 12, 1-5, I mentioned this already, Brian, that's where John has his vision, where he sees the woman clothed with the sun, a crown of 12 stars upon her head, and the moon underneath her feet. And she gives birth to the male child to rule with a rod of iron. The red dragon is there looking to devour the male child. Now, as we already said, we have good reason to think this woman is Mary. Why? Well, because John is mentioning 4 characters in total: the woman, the male child, the serpent, and Michael the archangel. if 3 of the 4 or refer to individual beings like St. Michael the Archangel, the devil, Jesus, well, then surely the 4th character, the woman's going to refer to an individual as well. Who might that be? Well, John describes her as the mother of the Messiah. That's Mary. Secondly, John is clearly drawing a parallel between Revelation 12, 1-5, and Genesis 3:15. You have the serpent of old, you have the child, the male child, and you have the woman. Well, in Genesis 3:15, Christians recognize that that seed of the woman is Jesus, that the serpent is Satan, and so the mother of that Messiah in Genesis 3:15 is Mary. So it's a prophecy about Mary. And given that Revelation 12, 1-5 is connected to that first prophecy, then the woman in Revelation 12, 1-5 is going to be a reference to Mary. So we have strong indication here that this woman is Mary. What about the bodily assumption? Well, notice, Brian, how John describes her in bodily form. He describes her as seeing her head and her feet. Now, initially, you might think, well, big deal. This is the book of Revelation. Metaphors are used all the time. But contrast this description, Brian, with the souls of those slain for the testimony of Jesus in Revelation 6:9. When that seal is lifted, John sees souls under the altar crying out for God to enact vengeance upon their enemies on earth. And notice how he describes them there. He describes them as souls. He does not describe them in bodily form. But yet here, with regard to the woman, he does describe the woman in bodily form, which stands in stark contrast to his description of the souls in heaven in Revelation 6:9. And so that gives grounds to say that John is having a vision of Mary in heaven in bodily form. And of course, that revelation converges with what we know by way of sacred tradition, that Mary was bodily assumed.
Now, if I could follow up with one more question before we end, I'm not sure how familiar you are with soul sleep, but there are a minority of Christians today, Protestants today, who say that Mary's still in the grave. Nobody's resurrected yet. She's not resurrected yet. So how could she be in heaven?
Well, that just begs the question against the Catholic who's giving argumentation for Mary's bodily assumption. To say that Mary has not been resurrected yet is to say Mary has not been bodily assumed. But that's the very question that we're trying to consider here, right? Was Mary bodily assumed? So that particular response would beg the question, assuming in its conclusion assuming in its premises what it's trying to prove, right? Assuming the conclusion is true in the premises. Now, with regard to soul sleep, often that is posed to us as Catholics in our belief that the saints in heaven are aware of what's going on in our lives here on earth and interceding for us, etc. Well, in response to that, Brian, I would simply go back to where I was, Revelation 6:9. Notice there, the souls of those slain for the testimony of Jesus are conscious and aware that their enemies are still living on earth. And secondly, they're engaging in rational activity. They're asking God to bestow vengeance upon their enemies on earth. That is completely at odds with the idea of soul sleep. Now, it is true that without such biblical revelation, if we're just working on philosophy alone and our own Knoggin and the nature of the human being and how we know things as rational animals, well, then it would follow from that once the soul departs from the body, then the soul of its own nature and power would be, quote unquote, in soul sleep, like wouldn't be engaging in the rational activity that it normally does in its human mode. But given the divine revelation of souls in heaven being aware and conscious of the things that are happening here on earth and engaging in rational activity, by way of God's grace and power, we can dispel this notion of soul sleep.
Absolutely. Great answer, and thank you for conquering these and tackling these dogmas. And I once again want to point people to your book. If you haven't seen his books yet, there is Meeting the Protestant Challenge and Meeting the Protestant Response, and he has more books as well, but these specifically answer commonly asked objections. Objections you're going to hear all the time against the Catholic Church. So you can check those out at thecatholic.com. I'm sure there are other places too. But I want to thank you for coming on the show today and for answering these for us.
Brian, thanks for having me, man. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
It is a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure for all of you to join us as well. Thank you all for joining us each and every week. Praise God, and please keep praying for us, the work we do. So many people are coming home because of the work we do, because of that work that Catholic Answers does. So please keep us all in your prayers. Please check out Catholic Answers website, Catholic.com, and please check out Karlo Broussard. I will link all of his information in the description section below. God bless you all.